The air in my parents' dining room always smelled the same on Sundays, a heavy, comforting mix of slow-roasted pot roast, rosemary, and the faint, dusty scent of the heirloom lace tablecloth that only came out for special occasions. Today, the occasion was supposed to be mine. I sat at the edge of my chair, my palm slightly damp against the fabric of my sundress. In my purse, tucked safely in a side pocket, was a black and white sonogram tucked inside a card. It showed a tiny, grain of rice-sized life that had already begun to shift the entire axis of my world. I was 8 weeks pregnant. My husband, Mark, squeezed my hand under the table, his thumb tracing soothing circles over my knuckles. He knew how nervous I was. My sister, Clara, hadn't arrived yet. She was always late, a habit she cultivated to ensure that when she finally walked through the door, every head in the room would turn her way. "Elena, you're barely touching your carrots," my mother remarked, hovering over me with a serving spoon. "Are you feeling all right? You look a bit peaked." "I'm fine, Mom," I lied, though the smell of the gravy was making my stomach do slow, nauseating rolls. "Just a long week at the office." Just then, the front door slammed. We heard the rhythmic click-clack of designer heels on the hardwood, followed by the dramatic rustle of shopping bags. Clara burst into the dining room like a whirlwind. She looked impeccable, as always, her hair a perfect blonde wave, her outfit a tailored cream jumpsuit that screamed effortless wealth, even though I knew she struggled with her credit card bills. Sorry. Clara chirped, blowing a kiss toward our father. The line at the boutique was insane, and then I had to stop for some ginger ale. My stomach has been in absolute knots lately. She took her seat across from me, her eyes darting over the table. There was a restlessness in Clara that I had lived with my whole life. She didn't just want to participate in life, she wanted to win it. If I got a B, she needed an A. If I got a promotion, she suddenly had a bigger career move in the works. It was an exhausting dance of sibling rivalry that I had long ago stopped trying to lead. "Well, now that we're all here," my father said, raising his water glass. "Elena said she had some news she wanted to share before we got to the dessert." This was it. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at Mark, who gave me a nod of encouragement. "Actually," I began, my voice trembling just a little. "Mark and I wanted to tell you all, that we're expanding the family. I'm pregnant. The baby is due in late October." I pulled the sonogram from my purse and placed it in the center of the table. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then, my mother let out a sharp cry of joy, knocking over her napkin as she rushed to hug me. My father's face broke into a wide, proud grin, his eyes misty. "A grandchild," he whispered. "Finally." It was a beautiful moment. It was the moment I had dreamed of for years. But as I leaned into my mother's embrace, I looked over her shoulder at Clara. My sister wasn't cheering. She wasn't smiling. For 3 seconds, her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated coldness. Her eyes narrowed as they fixed on the sonogram, her jaw tight. It wasn't the look of a sister, it was the look of a predator who had just seen someone else claim her territory. Then, the mask vanished. Clara let out a gasp that was louder than my mother's. She dropped her fork with a dramatic clang against her china plate. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she began to shake her head, her eyes wide with what looked like shocked realization. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Oh my God, Elena. You're kidding." "I'm not," I laughed, still caught up in the excitement. 8 weeks along. Clara stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. She didn't look at me, she looked at our parents. "I can't believe this. I was literally waiting for the cake to come out to tell you guys." She paused for maximum effect, her lip trembling with practiced precision. "Me too. I'm pregnant too. I'm 7 weeks. We're going to be pregnant together." The room shifted. The focus, which had been squarely on my husband and me, fractured. Clara. My mother gasped, her hands still on my shoulders but her eyes already drifting toward my sister. You too? 2 babies. I know. Clara cried, throwing her arms around our mother, effectively pushing me to the side. I found out 4 days ago. I've been so sick, that's why I needed the ginger ale. I was so nervous to say anything because I didn't want to jinx it, but seeing Elena's photo, I just couldn't keep it in. Mark's hand tightened on mine. I could feel his confusion. Clara hadn't mentioned a boyfriend in over a year. The last we heard, she was focusing on herself. That's incredible, honey, my father said, though he looked a little dazed. Who? I mean, do we know the father? Clara waved a hand dismissively. It's someone I've been seeing privately. It's complicated, Dad, but he's thrilled. We're just so happy. She finally looked at me, a bright, manic glint in her eyes. She leaned across the table and grabbed my wrists. Her grip was surprisingly tight, almost painful. Can you believe the timing, Elena? Our babies will be like twins. We'll do everything together. We'll go to the doctor together, shop for strollers together, decorate our nurseries together. It's going to be perfect. Just perfect. I tried to smile, but a strange chill had settled in my marrow. I looked down at Clara's stomach. It was as flat as a board, which was normal for 7 weeks, yet she was already rubbing it with a protective, performative gesture. As the evening wore on, the conversation was no longer about my pregnancy. It was about our pregnancies. But mostly, it was about Clara's. She complained the loudest about nausea. She asked the most questions about which elite preschools the babies should attend. She monopolized the floor, describing the miraculous way she felt her body changing. I just feel so connected to the universe already, Clara sighed, sipping her ginger ale as if it were a holy elixir. I feel this glow. Don't you feel it, Elena? I mostly just feel tired, I said quietly. Oh, you always were the sensitive one, Clara chirped. I think I'm just built for this. I feel stronger than ever. When Mark and I finally left that night, the silence in the car was heavy. That was quite the coincidence, Mark said, his voice cautious. I don't know, I whispered, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. Clara has a history of embellishing things. But she wouldn't lie about this. Not something this big. Right. She seemed pretty convinced, Mark replied. But did you notice? She didn't have a sonogram. She didn't even mention a doctor's name. It's early, I defended her, though I was trying to convince myself more than him. Maybe she hasn't had her first appointment yet. But as I closed my eyes that night, I couldn't shake the image of Clara's face in that split second before she announced her news. The coldness. The envy. It didn't look like the face of a woman who had been carrying a beautiful secret for 4 days. It looked like the face of someone who had just decided to write a script. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that pregnancy hormones were making me suspicious of my own sister. I wanted to believe that this would bring us closer. I didn't know then that the next 9 months wouldn't be a journey of sisterhood. They would be a meticulously crafted lie, a slow-motion heist where the prize wasn't money or fame. The prize was the life growing inside of me. By the time I hit my second trimester, the initial euphoria of my pregnancy had been replaced by a weary, grounding reality. My morning sickness had subsided into a dull, constant hunger, and my jeans had officially surrendered to the elastic waistbands of maternity leggings. But as my world became more centered on prenatal vitamins and nursery paint swatches, the atmosphere around my sister, Clara, grew increasingly surreal. If my pregnancy was a grueling marathon, Clara's was a high-budget theater production. We were sitting in a sun-drenched bistro in mid-June, the heat outside already shimmering off the pavement. I felt like a bloated whale, my ankles beginning to protest the humidity. Clara, on the other hand, looked like she had just stepped off the cover of a chic motherhood magazine. She was wearing a tight, ribbed jersey dress that accentuated a small, perfectly round bump. "You're showing so much more than I am, Elena," she said, her voice laced with a cloying sweetness as she poked at a kale salad. "But then again, my doctor says I have tight abdominal walls. The baby is just tucked away in there, safe and sound." I took a sip of my iced decaf, trying to ignore the prickle of irritation. "It's not a competition, Clara. Every body carries differently. Have you felt any movement yet?" "I felt a little flutter last night. Like a tiny fish." Clara's hand immediately went to her stomach, her fingers splaying across the fabric. "Oh, all the time. This little one is a gymnast. Sometimes it's so intense I can't even sleep." "Really? At 16 weeks?" I asked, leaning forward. "That's early for a first pregnancy. Can I feel?" I reached out my hand, a natural, sisterly gesture. But before my fingers could even graze the fabric of her dress, Clara flinched. She pulled back so sharply she almost knocked over her water glass. "No," she snapped. Then, seeing my shocked expression, she softened her features into a mask of fragile vulnerability. "I'm sorry, Elle. It's just. I'm so sensitive. The doctor says I have a touch of hyperesthesia. Even the friction of my clothes makes me want to scream. I can't handle anyone touching me right now." "Oh. I didn't know that was a thing," I muttered, retracting my hand. A cold knot began to form in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't just the refusal, it was the way her skin hadn't seemed to move under the dress when she jumped. It looked stiff. So, I shifted the subject, trying to shake off the unease. "When is your next big scan?" "Mark and I have our 20-week anatomy scan in a few weeks. We're finally going to find out the gender." "Are you going to find out?" Clara's eyes darted to the window for a split second before returning to mine. "Actually, I've already had a few scans. But my doctor is very old school. He doesn't believe in printing out photos. He says it encourages fetal vanity or something ridiculous. And he's very strict about privacy. No phones in the room." I frowned. "That sounds incredibly weird, Clara. Which clinic are you going to? Maybe you should get a second opinion. Every doctor I know gives you at least one grainy printout for the fridge." "I like him," she said firmly, her tone ending the conversation. "He's a specialist. Very high-end. You wouldn't know the practice, it's over in the city, near the harbor." The veil of secrecy didn't just apply to medical records, it extended to every facet of her journey. Whenever I suggested a joint shopping trip for cribs, Clara would already have bought the most expensive model online. Whenever I shared a concern about child care, she would claim to have already interviewed 3 elite nannies. She was always one step ahead, yet there was a glaring lack of evidence. No boxes arriving at her house, no baby brain slip UPS, no genuine exhaustion. The most disturbing incident happened in late July. My mother had organized a small sprinkle lunch for both of us. It was a humid afternoon, and the air conditioning in my parents' house was struggling to keep up. I was sitting on the sofa, fanning myself, when I noticed Clara heading toward the powder room. She was wearing a heavy silk wrap dress, beautiful, but entirely too warm for a 90-degree day. As she walked, she tripped slightly on the edge of the rug. She didn't fall, but she lurched forward, her hands flying out to steady herself against the wall. As she did, I saw it. The bump on her stomach didn't jiggle. It didn't shift with her center of gravity. For a horrifying second, as the silk of her dress pulled taut against her frame, the shape of her belly looked angular. like the edge of a prosthetic that had shifted an inch too far to the left. "Clara, are you okay?" my mother cried, rushing over. "I'm fine," Clara shouted, her voice uncharacteristically shrill. She scrambled to readjust her dress, her hands frantically smoothing the fabric over her midsection. "I just got dizzy. Leave me alone." She bolted into the bathroom and locked the door. She stayed in there for 20 minutes. When she finally emerged, the bump was perfectly centered again, and she had draped a pashmina shawl over herself despite the heat. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, watching Mark put together a bookshelf for the nursery. "Mark," I said softly, "I think something is wrong with Clara." He stopped, a screwdriver in his hand. "Besides the usual drama." "I think she's faking it," I whispered. The words felt like lead in my mouth. "I think she's pretending to be pregnant because I am." Mark sighed, sitting down next to me. That's a huge accusation. I know she's competitive, and yeah, she's being weird about the photos and the touching, but, to fake a whole human life. For 9 months. That's some next level movie villain stuff." I saw her belly shift, Mark. It didn't look like skin and muscle. It looked like hardware. "Maybe it was a support belt," Mark suggested. "Lots of women wear those for back pain. Maybe she's embarrassed about needing one." I wanted to believe him. I desperately wanted to be the crazy, hormonal sister rather than the sister of a woman who was weaving a web of lies out of thin air. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were growing faster than the baby in my womb. A week later, I decided to test her. I invited her over for a nursery organization day. I told her I had bought a bunch of maternity clothes that didn't fit me and wanted to see if she wanted them. When she arrived, she was as polished as ever. I led her into the nursery, which was cluttered with boxes of onesies and diapers. "Here," I said, handing her a pair of maternity jeans. "These were way too tight in the thighs for me. Why don't you try them on in the guest room? If they fit you, you can have the whole bag." Clara took the jeans, her expression flickering with a moment of genuine panic. "Oh, I don't need these, Elle. I have plenty of clothes." "Just try them, Clara. They're designer. You'll love them." I said no, she snapped, tossing the jeans onto the changing table. "I don't like trying on clothes in front of people. It's a body dysmorphia thing. My doctor said I should avoid it." "In front of me? I'm your sister." I stepped closer, my heart racing. "Clara, just take off the shawl. Let me see your belly. We're both pregnant. We should be bonding over our stretch marks, not hiding behind shawls and old-school doctors." Clara backed away, her eyes flashing with a cold, predatory light I had only seen once before the night of the announcement. "You're jealous," she hissed. "That's what this is. You're jealous that I'm carrying this better than you. You're jealous that I'm not a swollen, tired mess. You want to find something wrong with me because you can't handle that for once, I'm the one who's doing it perfectly." I was speechless. The sheer audacity of her projection was breathtaking. "I'm not jealous, Clara," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm worried about you. I'm worried that you're so desperate for attention that you'd lie to our entire family." Clara took a step toward me, her face inches from mine. She smelled of expensive perfume and something metallic like the scent of a new car. "Be very careful, Elena," she whispered. "If you start telling people I'm faking it, you'll be the one who looks insane. A pregnant woman accusing another pregnant woman of lying? Mom and Dad will think you've had a nervous breakdown. Do you really want to be the unstable one while I'm the perfect mother?" She turned on her heel and walked out, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood. I sank onto the floor of the nursery, surrounded by half-assembled furniture and tiny clothes. My son kicked a sharp, Solid thud against my ribs. It was real. He was real. But as I looked at the door Clara had just walked through, I realized that the miraculous coincidence was over. The game had begun. And Clara wasn't just playing for attention anymore. She was playing for keeps. I looked at the sonogram of Theo pinned to the wall. For the first time, a wave of pure, primal fear washed over me. Clara wasn't just faking a pregnancy. She was creating a space in her life for a child. And if she didn't have a child of her own to fill it by October, I knew exactly whose child she was planning to take. By early October, the world felt like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I was 38 weeks pregnant, and every movement felt like trying to roll a boulder uphill. My ankles had disappeared into a puff of swelling, and sleep was a distant memory, replaced by a series of uncomfortable naps punctuated by the baby's rhythmic thumping against my ribs. But while I was dissolving into the messy, exhausting reality of late-stage pregnancy, Clara was ascending into a strange sort of sainthood. She had moved into her nesting phase with a fervor that bordered on the manic. Her social media was a curated gallery of neutral-toned baby clothes, hand-carved wooden toys, and pregnancy glow selfies that looked suspiciously filtered. But the most alarming development was her announcement at the family dinner 2 weeks before my due date. "I've decided on a home birth," Clara said, daintily sipping herbal tea while I struggled to find a comfortable position on my parents' armchair. "I've hired a private midwife, Siobhan. She's very exclusive, very off the grid. She doesn't believe in the sterile, cold environment of a hospital. She wants the baby to enter the world in an atmosphere of peace and familiar sense." My mother beamed. "Oh, Clara, how brave. How natural." I looked at Mark, who was subtly shaking his head. I knew what he was thinking. No hospital means no records. No birth certificate. No witnesses. "That sounds intense, Clara," I said, my voice strained. "What if there's a complication? What if you need an emergency C-section? Who is this Siobhan? What's her last name?" Clara's smile didn't reach her eyes. It never did anymore. "You're always so focused on the negative, Elena. Not everyone wants to be poked and prodded by strangers in blue scrubs. Siobhan has handled hundreds of births. I trust her. And frankly, her privacy is part of why she's so sought after." I tried to find Siobhan online that night. I searched every midwifery board and licensing registry in the state. Nothing. No Siobhan, no private holistic birth centers matching Clara's descriptions. It was a ghost story, a convenient shadow she was using to hide the fact that there would be no labor, no delivery, and no medical staff to verify the existence of a child. On October 15th, my water broke at 3 in the morning. The next 24 hours were a blur of pain, bright lights, and the overwhelming scent of antiseptic. When Theo was finally placed on my chest, warm, slippery, and screaming with the force of 1,000 suns, the world finally made sense. I didn't care about Clara. I didn't care about the silicone belly I suspected her of wearing. I only cared about the tiny heartbeat fluttering against my skin. Clara visited the hospital the next afternoon. She walked into the recovery room wearing a loose-fitting linen tunic and a wide-brimmed hat. She didn't look like a woman who was supposedly 37 weeks pregnant herself. She looked like she was visiting a museum. "He's efficient," she said, standing at the foot of the bed. She didn't ask to hold him. She just stared at Theo with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Her eyes weren't fixed on his face, they were scanning his features, his hair color, the shape of his ears. "He looks just like the nursery I decorated," she whispered, almost to herself. "What a strange thing to say, Clara," Mark remarked, stepping between her and the bassinet. Clara snapped out of her trance and forced a laugh. "Oh, you know what I mean. He's just so perfect. He's exactly what a baby should be." She left shortly after, complaining of Braxton Hicks contractions. But as the door swung shut behind her, I saw her reflection in the glass. She wasn't clutching her stomach in pain. She was standing perfectly upright, her face set in a grim, determined line. 2 weeks later, the silence was broken. I was at home, finally settling into a rhythm with Theo. The house smelled of breast milk and laundry detergent. I was exhausted, but happy. Then, the phone rang. It was my mother, her voice a jagged wreck of sobs. "Elena, oh God, Elena, it's Clara." My heart plummeted. What happened? Is she okay? She lost the baby, my mother wailed. She went into labor last night at home. She said Siobhan told her everything was fine, but then, something went wrong. By the time Siobhan called an ambulance, it was too late. The baby didn't make it. A cold, cynical part of me wanted to shout, there was no baby. But the horror in my mother's voice was real. The grief was real. Where is she? I asked, my voice trembling. She's at home, Mom sobbed. She refused to go to the hospital after they took the baby away. She's locked herself in the nursery. She won't talk to anyone. Oh, Elena, it's a tragedy. My poor girl. I hung up the phone and looked at Theo, sleeping soundly in his rocker. A sickening realization washed over me. This was the exit strategy. Clara had spent 9 months building a lie, and now she was using the ultimate tragedy to bury the evidence. A stillbirth at home meant there would be no hospital records of a birth, and she could play the victim for the rest of her life, garnering the sympathy and attention she craved. But there was one thing she hadn't accounted for, I knew her better than anyone. "Mark, stay with Theo," I said, grabbing my keys. "I have to go over there." Wait, if she's grieving." "She's not grieving, Mark. She's hiding." I drove to Clara's townhouse in a fever. When I arrived, the house was dark. My parents' car was in the driveway, but no one answered the door. I used the spare key Clara had given me years ago and slipped inside. The living room was silent. My parents were in the kitchen, huddled over mugs of tea, their faces gaunt. "She's upstairs," my father whispered. "She won't let us in." I walked past them, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I climbed the stairs and stood before the door to the nursery. It was a beautiful door, painted a soft, eggshell blue. "Clara!" I called out. "It's Elena." "Open the door." Silence. "Clara, I know you're in there. Open up, or I'm calling the police to do a wellness check." The lock clicked. The door creaked open just a few inches. Clara stood in the shadows. She wasn't wearing the linen tunic anymore. She was in a silk robe, cinched tight at the waist. Her face was dry. There were no red eyes, no tear-streaked cheeks. She looked tired, yes, but it wasn't the exhaustion of grief. It was the exhaustion of a performer after a long show. "You shouldn't be here, Elena," she said coldly. "I've had a traumatic experience." "Where's the midwife, Clara? Where's Siobhan? Where are the paramedics? Where's the paperwork from the coroner?" "They took him," she whispered. I couldn't look. I couldn't stay. I pushed past her into the nursery. It was a masterpiece of deception. A crib stood in the corner, draped in expensive lace. A changing table was stocked with diapers and wipes. It was a shrine to a child that never existed. "Get out," Clara hissed. I ignored her. I began opening drawers. I pulled aside the plush teddy bears. And then, I saw it. The closet door was slightly ajar. I marched over and threw it open. Tucked behind a row of tiny, unworn cashmere sweaters was a plastic bin. I reached in and pulled out a heavy, flesh-colored object. It was a medical-grade silicone pregnancy belly. It was weighted to feel like a real third trimester stomach. It even had a fake belly button and realistic-looking veins. I turned around, holding the hollow rubber torso like a trophy. "Is this the baby you lost, Clara?" I asked, my voice vibrating with rage. "Is this the trauma you're putting Mom and Dad through?" Clara didn't flinch. She didn't break down and confess. Instead, she stepped further into the room, the moonlight from the window catching the sharp angles of her face. She looked at the silicone belly in my hands with a strange sort of affection. "I did the work, Elena," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "I felt every kick I imagined. I went through the morning sickness I performed. I spent 9 months preparing my soul to be a mother. I bought the clothes, I picked the name, I lived the life." "You lied." I screamed. "You lied about a human life." "I created a space for one," she countered, stepping closer. "And you have too. You have your life, and you have Theo. You've always had everything so easy. The husband who loves you, the career that stayed on track, the perfect pregnancy. And now you have a son." She reached out, her fingers grazing the lace of the empty crib. "Theo should be mine," she whispered. "I've already spent 9 months being his mother in my mind. I've suffered more for him than you ever did. It's only fair, Elena. You can always have another one. But I've already done the time. You should give him to me." I backed away, the silicone belly slipping from my fingers and hitting the floor with a dull, sickening thud. I looked at my sister, the woman I had shared a womb with, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a sibling. I saw a monster who had spent 9 months building a cage, and she was waiting for me to walk inside. "You're never coming near my son again," I breathed. "We'll see," Clara said, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across her lips. "Mom and Dad already believe me. Who do you think they'll trust? Their grieving daughter who lost her child, or the postpartum sister who's hallucinating rubber bellies in a closet?" I realized then that the stillbirth wasn't the end of her lie. It was the beginning of her leverage. The silicone belly hit the floor with a sound that I will never forget, a hollow, rubbery thud that seemed to echo through the quiet nursery like a death knell. For a second, the world stood still. I stood there, chest heaving, pointing at the evidence of the greatest lie ever told. I expected a breakdown. I expected Clara to fall to her knees and beg for forgiveness. Instead, she did something much worse. She began to cry. But it wasn't the cry of a caught liar. It was the high-pitched, hysterical wail of a victim. "Mom! Dad! Help me!" Clara shrieked, her voice tearing through the upstairs hallway. Within seconds, the thundering footsteps of our parents raced up the stairs. They burst into the room to find Clara huddled in the corner, shaking, and me standing over her like a common bully, holding a discarded piece of rubber. "Elena! What on earth are you doing?" my mother cried, rushing past me to scoop Clara into her arms. "Look at this, Mom!" I shouted, kicking the silicone belly toward them. She was never pregnant. I found this in her closet. The whole thing, the 9 months, the morning sickness, the midwife, it was all a lie. There is no dead baby because there was never a baby at all. My father picked up the silicone torso, his hands trembling. He looked at it, then at me, then at Clara. For a heartbeat, I thought I had won. I thought the truth would finally set us free from her madness. But Clara looked up from our mother's shoulder, her face a mask of pure, shattered innocence. She brought it with her," Clara sobbed, her finger shaking as she pointed at me. "She came in here, while I'm mourning my son, and she threw that thing at me. She told me my baby wasn't real. She's trying to take away the only memory I have left. She's obsessed, Dad. She's been jealous of my pregnancy since day one." The air left the room. My father dropped the silicone belly as if it were covered in acid. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and profound disappointment. "Elena," he said softly, his voice heavy with a grief I couldn't touch. "I know the stress of a new baby is hard. I know you're tired. But to do this? To plant something so ghoulish in your sister's house while she's bleeding and broken? This is beneath you." "I didn't plant it," I screamed, the frustration bubbling up like bile. "It was in the closet. Behind the sweaters. Check her medical records, Dad. Ask to see the death certificate. Call the hospital." "There was no hospital, Elena. You know she had a home birth." My mother snapped, her eyes flashing with a protective fire. "The midwife handled everything. Clara is in no state to be interrogated by you. I think you need to leave. Right now." I was ushered out of the house like a criminal. As I stood on the sidewalk in the cold October night, I looked back at the nursery window. The light was still on. For a split second, the curtain moved. Clara was standing there, looking down at me. She wasn't crying anymore. She gave me a small, slow wave, the kind a queen gives to a subject, and then closed the drapes. The next week was a psychological minefield. Clara didn't go into hiding, she went on the offensive. She organized a memorial service for the baby she named Leo. It was a small, invitation-only event at a local botanical garden. My parents begged me to attend for the sake of family unity. Mark told me we should go just to keep an eye on her. It was the most surreal experience of my life. There was no casket, only an urn filled with ashes that Clara claimed were from the private cremation the midwife had arranged. Friends from high school, distant cousins, and neighbors all lined up to hug her. They brought casseroles and flowers. They looked at me with hushed whispers, clearly having heard the rumors of my postpartum breakdown at Clara's house. Clara played the part of the grieving mother to perfection. She wore a black veil, moved with a fragile limp, and carried a small, blue knitted blanket, one that I recognized. It was the one I had bought for Theo, but which had gone missing from my baby shower. "He was so beautiful," I heard her whisper to Aunt Martha. "He had Elena's nose." That's the hardest part, looking at her son and seeing what I lost. The audacity of it made my vision blur. She wasn't just faking a tragedy, she was actively linking her loss to my son's existence. She was weaving a narrative where Theo was a substitute for the hole in her life. The real nightmare began 3 days after the memorial. I was in the kitchen, exhausted, trying to get a colicky Theo to settle down, when the doorbell rang. It was Clara. She was carrying a bag of groceries and a breast pump. "What are you doing here?" I asked, blocking the doorway. "I'm here to help, Elle," she said, pushing past me with a terrifyingly bright smile. "Mom told me you weren't sleeping. And since since my body still thinks I have a baby to feed, I thought I could help you with the night shifts." "Your body doesn't think anything, Clara. You were never pregnant. Get out." She ignored me, setting the groceries on the counter. She walked straight over to Theo's rocker. Before I could stop her, she picked him up. The way she held him wasn't the way an aunt holds a nephew. She tucked his head under her chin, closing her eyes and inhaling the scent of his hair with an expression of pure, hungry possession. "He's hungry," she murmured. "I can feel it. My milk is coming in, Elena. It's a medical miracle. The doctor says it's phantom lactation brought on by the trauma. I can actually provide for him." I felt a surge of adrenaline so sharp it made my hands shake. I snatched Theo out of her arms. "You are not feeding my son. You are not staying here. If you don't leave this second, I am calling the police and I will tell them everything." Clara didn't flinch. She just straightened her cardigan. "Go ahead. Call them. I'll tell them you're suffering from postpartum psychosis. I'll tell them you tried to hurt me at the memorial. I'll tell them you're neglecting Theo because you're so obsessed with proving I wasn't pregnant. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. The police see it all the time, Elena. Tired mom snapping. But I'm here. I'm the stable one now. I'm the one the family trusts. If you fight me, I'll make sure the state decides you're an unfit mother. And guess who's next in line for custody? A grieving sister who just lost her own child and has a nursery already waiting. It was a checkmate. She had spent 9 months building a legal and emotional trap. By faking the pregnancy, she hadn't just gained attention, she had created a right to a child in the eyes of our family. What do you want? I whispered, clutching Theo so tight he began to fuss. Clara smiled a thin, jagged line of triumph. I want what's mine, Elena. I want him for the weekends. I want to be his co-mother. I want you to admit to mom and dad that you lied about the silicone belly. Do that, and maybe I won't tell the social worker about the incident with the kitchen knife you supposedly had last night. I never touched a knife. My word against yours, sister, she chirped, heading for the door. Think about it. I'll be back tomorrow at 10 for my visitation. Have his bag packed. As she walked down the driveway, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for my reputation anymore. I was fighting for my son's life. Clara didn't want a baby, she wanted my life. She wanted the version of me that was happy and whole, and she was willing to burn the entire family down to get it. I looked at Theo's tiny, innocent face. I won't let her, I promised him. But as I looked at the phone, I realized I couldn't call the police. I couldn't call my parents. I was completely, utterly alone in a house haunted by a ghost baby and a sister who was losing her mind. I needed a plan. I needed to catch her in a lie that even my parents couldn't ignore. And I knew exactly where to start. I needed to find Siobhan, the invisible midwife. The house felt like a fortress under siege. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the window pane, sounded like Clara's footsteps. I sat in the darkened nursery, the only light coming from a small, star-shaped nightlight on the dresser. Theo was asleep in my arms, his tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was the only thing keeping me sane. Clara's visitation was scheduled for the next morning. She had been systematic, using our parents as her unwitting infantry. My mother had called 3 times today, her voice a mix of pity and sternness, reminding me that Clara is going through a loss you can't imagine, Elena. Let her hold the baby. It's healing. They didn't see the predator behind the veil. They didn't see the woman who had stood in my kitchen and threatened to have me committed. But I realized then that I couldn't win by screaming the truth. In a house of mirrors, the loudest person always looks the craziest. I had to stop being the victim and start being the architect of her downfall. I waited until midnight, when I knew Clara would be tucked away in her townhouse, likely admiring her empty nursery. I called Mark, who was staying at a hotel nearby to keep a low profile, a strategic move we'd decided on to avoid escalating the family tension. Mark, I whispered into the phone. I need you to do something dangerous. I need you to go to Clara's house. She's at mom and dad's tonight. They wanted to watch over her after her breakdown. Her townhouse is empty. That's breaking and entering, Mark hissed. No, I still have the spare key she forgot I had. Look for her laptop. Look for the midwife's contact info. Look for anything that isn't a nursery rhyme. There has to be a paper trail for the lies. Nobody fakes a life without leaving a digital footprint. 2 hours later, Mark called back. His voice was shaking. Elena, it's worse than we thought. I found the browser history. She wasn't just Googling fake bellies. She was on forums for reborn dolls and role-play motherhood. And the midwife? Siobhan isn't a person. It's an AI-generated profile Clara created. She's been sending herself emails from Siobhan and forwarding them to mom. What about the ashes? I asked, my heart hammering. The urn at the memorial. A receipt from a pet crematorium, Mark replied, his voice flat with horror. She bought generic remains. Elena, she's not just lying. She's built a whole alternate reality. And there's one more thing. A folder on her desktop labeled the transfer. It's full of legal templates for kinship adoption and voluntary surrender of parental rights. The room felt ice cold. She wasn't just waiting for me to snap, she was preparing the paperwork for when I did. Bring the laptop to Mom and Dad's at 10 tomorrow, I said, my voice hardening. Don't say a word. Just show up. The next morning, the air was thick with the scent of rain and tension. I arrived at my parents' house with Theo strapped to my chest. I didn't bring a diaper bag. I didn't bring toys. I brought a folder of my own. Clara was already there, sitting on the sofa in a pale gray cashmere sweater, looking like a portrait of tragic grace. My mother was hovering over her with a plate of toast. There she is, my mother said, her voice cautious. Elena, thank you for coming. Clara stood up, her eyes immediately locking onto Theo. She didn't look at me. She didn't even acknowledge my existence. She reached out her arms, her fingers wiggling in that gimme gesture that sent a jolt of primal rage through my body. Give him to me, Elena, Clara whispered. I've had such a hard night. I need to feel his heart. No, I said. The word was small, but it cut through the room like a blade. Elena, please, my father warned from the doorway. Don't start. I'm not starting anything, Dad. I'm finishing it. I turned to Clara. How was the home birth, Clara? Did Siobhan hold your hand? Clara's expression didn't change, but her eyes flickered. You know how it was. It was a nightmare. Why are you doing this now? Because Siobhan isn't real, Clara. She's an app. And the ashes in that urn? They belong to a golden retriever from the Valley Pet Cemetery. My mother gasped, clutching her chest. Elena. That is a disgusting thing to say. Is it? I pulled the printed receipts from my folder. Here is the invoice for the silicone belly, purchased 8 months ago. Here is the receipt for the miscarriage makeup kit she used to fake the blood for the paramedics. And here, I paused as the front door opened and Mark walked in, holding the laptop, is the transfer folder. The one where Clara explains how she's going to use Mom and Dad to pressure me into giving her my son. I laid the papers on the coffee table. My father stepped forward, his face pale. He picked up the receipt for the silicone belly. He looked at the date. He looked at the shipping address, Clara's townhouse. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of a 9-month-old illusion shattering into a million jagged pieces. Clara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She sat back down on the sofa and crossed her legs. The grieving mother mask fell away, revealing the cold, calculating woman I had seen in the shadows for months. It doesn't matter, Clara said, her voice devoid of emotion. Even if I didn't carry him, I'm the one who deserves him. You don't appreciate him, Elena. You complain about the sleep, the mess, the cost. I would have been perfect. I am perfect. The universe owed me a child, and you just happened to be the vessel. The universe didn't owe you anything, Clara, I said, stepping toward her. You're not a mother. You're a thief who tried to steal a soul because you couldn't be bothered to build your own life. My mother was sobbing now, but she wasn't hugging Clara. She was backed away against the wall, looking at her eldest daughter as if she were a stranger. You lied to us, she whispered. We cried for that baby. We held you while you mourned. How could you do that to your own parents? Clara looked at our mother with genuine confusion. I gave you what you wanted. You wanted another grandchild. I gave you the story. I gave you the emotion. Why does the how matter so much to you people? Because it's not real. My father roared, throwing the papers onto the floor. Get out, Clara. Get out of this house. Clara stood up slowly. She smoothed her sweater, her eyes drifting one last time to Theo. For a second, I saw a flicker of something truly dangerous in her gaze, a desperate, cornered animal look. She lunged forward, her hands clawing for Theo's carrier. He's mine. She shrieked, her voice finally breaking into a jagged, terrifying sound. I did the 9 months. He belongs to me. Mark grabbed her arms, pinning them behind her back. She thrashed and kicked, screaming obscenities that made my mother cover her ears. It wasn't the scream of a grieving mother, it was the tantrum of a child whose toy had been taken away. The police arrived 10 minutes later. We didn't press charges for the fake pregnancy, that wasn't a crime, but the attempted kidnapping and the harassment were enough to get a temporary restraining order. As they led her to the cruiser, Clara turned back to look at me through the rain. She didn't look crazy anymore. She looked empty. Like the silicone belly I'd found in her closet, she was just a hollow shell designed to look like something human. The aftermath was a quiet, somber affair. My parents were broken. The betrayal had aged them a decade in a single morning. They apologized to me, over and over, but the trust we once had was a fractured thing that would take years to mend. Mark and I didn't stay to watch them pick up the pieces. We sold our house and moved 3 states away, to a town where nobody knew the story of the twin pregnancies. We didn't leave a forwarding address for the family. Now, when I look at Theo, I don't see the shadow of Clara's lies. I see a boy who is loved for who he is, not for the role he was meant to play in someone else's fantasy. I still have nightmares sometimes. I dream of a woman in a silk robe, standing in a nursery with a rubber stomach, reaching for my son. But then I wake up to the sound of Theo's laughter or the warmth of Mark's hand in mine, and I remember. The truth doesn't just set you free. It builds a wall that no lie can ever climb over.